The air in that cheap motel room was thick with the scent of us, a mix of sweat and her perfume, a scent I knew I would have to scrub from my skin before I went home. The only light came from a crack in the curtains, a sliver of gray afternoon that cut across the tangled sheets, across the curve of her hip. Her name, Maya, was a half-formed prayer on my lips, a sound lost in the rhythm of our bodies. The world outside, with its traffic and its responsibilities, had faded to a dull hum, replaced by the immediate, overwhelming reality of her. The desperate slide of skin against skin, the soft, muffled cries she pressed into my shoulder, the frantic beat of my own heart in my ears. This was not gentle, it wasn't kind, it was a raw, hungry thing, a fire we had both been starving for, and in that moment, in that anonymous room, we were burning it all down. But that was later. Before the motel rooms, before the lies became a second language, I spoke more fluently than the truth. There was only silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that filled every corner of my beautiful, sterile suburban home. It was the kind of quiet that is louder than any noise. A quiet punctuated only by the soft click of my wife Sarah's knitting needles, or the low murmur of a medical drama on the television. Our house smelled of antiseptic and lemon polish, a constant clinical reminder of the illness that lived upstairs in the guest room. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, was dying, and her slow decline had drained all the color from our lives, leaving behind a monochrome existence of duty and quiet grief. Sarah, my wife, had become a ghost. I loved her, or at least, I loved the memory of the woman she used to be, but now she was just a tired, sad stranger who shared my bed. Her back always turned to me. And then Maya arrived. She was the caregiver, the professional sent by an agency to manage the practicalities of death that we were failing to handle. She walked into the oppressive quiet of our home, and it felt as if someone had finally opened a window. She wasn't loud or intrusive, quite the opposite. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her voice a low, calming melody when she spoke to Eleanor. But there was a life in her, a warmth in her dark eyes that seemed to absorb the gloom and not reflect it. The first time I saw her, she was standing in the kitchen, her back to me, simply looking out at the rain-soaked garden. And in that simple, unguarded moment, I felt a stir of something I thought had died in me long ago. It wasn't just desire, not yet. It was more dangerous than that. It was curiosity. It was hope. The first few days with Maya in the house were a study in quiet adjustment. She established a new rhythm, a gentle and predictable current in the stagnant pool our lives had become. There was the soft hum of the oxygen concentrator, a sound I had come to associate with dread, but now it was accompanied by the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of Maya's movements, the quiet click of a door, the whisper of her rubber-soled shoes on the hardwood floors. She had a way of being present without being intrusive, a professional ghost who haunted the daylight hours, her sole purpose to ease the passage of another ghost from this world. At first, I kept my distance, treating her with a polite, formal detachment. I was the man of the house, she was an employee, and the lines felt clear. I would see her in the morning, her dark hair pulled back neatly into a ponytail, her face clean and serious, and I would nod, ask if she needed anything, and then retreat to my car and the sterile anonymity of my office downtown. It was a simple transaction, a service rendered, a problem for which we had finally found a solution. But the house drew me back. I began to find reasons to work from home, spreading my architectural drawings across the large oak table in the dining room, a space we hadn't used for a proper meal in months. From there, I had a clear line of sight down the hall. I told myself it was to be available, to support Sarah, to be on hand in case of an emergency. It was a noble lie, a carefully constructed piece of self-deception. The truth was, I was watching Maya. My work became a pretense, the intricate lines of buildings and support beams blurring into the background as my attention was pulled, again and again, to her. I learned the sound of her breathing, the cadence of her footsteps. I watched her prepare Eleanor's lunch, the methodical way she cut the crusts off the bread, the gentle patience in her hands as she arranged the plate. Her hands. I became fascinated by her hands. They were not delicate or manicured. They were capable, practical. I watched them measure out medication into a small cup with unwavering steadiness. I saw the way she would rest them on Eleanor's frail shoulder, a simple, human gesture of comfort that seemed to convey more warmth than any words could. I saw the faint network of veins on the back of her hands, the neat, clean line of her short fingernails, and I would find myself staring at my own hands, resting on the blueprints, and I would imagine what it would feel like to have her touch me, to feel that gentle, competent pressure on my own arm, a silent acknowledgement of the strain I felt. The thought was a small, sharp betrayal, and I would quickly look away, my cheeks flushing with a heat that was part guilt, part something else, something I refused to name. She was a stark contrast to Sarah, and this observation filled me with the most profound sense of shame. It wasn't fair. I knew it wasn't. Sarah was running on empty, a marathon runner in the final, grueling mile of a race she never wanted to enter. Her energy was consumed by her mother, by anticipatory grief, by the endless logistics of illness. Her beauty, once so vibrant, had become brittle, her skin stretched taut over her cheekbones, her eyes holding a permanent look of exhaustion. When she spoke to me, her voice was often frayed at the edges, sharp with a stress that had no other outlet. I would see her frustration, her sorrow, and my heart would ache for her. But then, I would see Maya. I would see her coax a rare smile from Eleanor, her own face lighting up in response. I would hear her low, soft laugh, a sound like wind chimes, as she recounted a simple story to her patient. And I would feel a pang of longing so intense it was like a physical blow. It was a longing for lightness, for warmth, for the effortless ease that Maya seemed to carry within her. I began to engineer small moments of contact. In the morning, I would make a pot of coffee, and I would make sure to pour her a cup, leaving it on the counter for her. "Maya, coffee's ready if you'd like some," I'd call out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. She would emerge from the hallway with a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Liam. You don't have to do that." But I did. I needed to. I needed that small interaction, that brief moment where our roles as employer and employee dissolved and we were just two people sharing a simple morning ritual. I would linger in the kitchen while she drank it, leaning against the counter, asking about her night, about Eleanor, about anything at all, just to keep her there for a few more minutes. I learned that she liked to read history books, that she was saving up to take a trip to Italy, that she found the rain calming. These were small, insignificant details, but to me they were treasures, pieces of a puzzle I was assembling in my mind. Each new fact made her more real, more three-dimensional, and deepened the chasm between the life I wanted and the one I was living. I was becoming an expert on a woman I barely knew, while the woman I had promised my life to became more and more of a stranger. The silence in the house remained, but now, for me, it was charged with an electric, unspoken tension. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence before the storm. The small, polite rituals of morning coffee slowly bled into something else, something deeper and far more dangerous. It began one evening, long after the sun had set, leaving the house in a deep, velvety darkness. Sarah had taken a sleeping pill and retreated to the bedroom early, a surrender she made more and more often. The silence she left behind was absolute. I came downstairs, thirsty for a glass of water, but really, I was just restless, unable to settle, my mind a churning sea of anxiety and unspoken resentment. I found Maya in the kitchen, sitting at the small breakfast nook, bathed in the soft golden glow of the single light above the table. She had a book open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. She was just staring out the dark window, at her own faint reflection, and I saw a weariness in her that mirrored my own. She didn't seem startled when I entered, just looked up, her eyes dark and knowing. "Long day," I said, my voice sounding rough. She gave a small, tired smile. "They're all long days, Liam." That was it. That was the opening. I didn't get a glass of water. I put on a pot of coffee, the quiet gurgle of the machine a welcome intrusion into the silence. I sat down opposite her, and we didn't speak while it brewed. We just shared the quiet, and it was a different kind of quiet from the one I shared with Sarah. This was comfortable, a shared space, not an empty one. When the coffee was ready, I poured 2 mugs, and the simple act felt deeply, profoundly intimate. And then I started to talk. I don't even remember what I said at first. Something about a project at work, a frustration with a client. It was mundane, meaningless. But she listened. She didn't offer advice. She didn't interrupt. She just watched me, her chin resting on her hand, her gaze steady and focused. She made me feel as if my small, work-related frustrations were the most important story in the world. And so, I kept talking. The words began to spill out of me, a torrent I couldn't control. I spoke of the house, how the walls themselves felt like they were grieving, how I sometimes walked into a room and forgot why I was there. I told her how it felt to be the rock, the stable one, when all I wanted to do was crumble. I never mentioned Sarah's name, not in a negative way. I couldn't. But Maya understood what I wasn't saying. I was talking about the crushing loneliness of being a partner to someone who was no longer there, whose spirit had been consumed by the specter of death. I spoke of my own guilt, the terrible feeling of wanting to escape, of wanting to breathe air that wasn't thick with the smell of medicine and sorrow. I confessed that my biggest fear was that when this was all over, when the illness was finally gone, there would be nothing left of us, of me and Sarah, just two strangers hollowed out by the ordeal. I laid myself bare in the soft glow of that kitchen light, and I expected her to recoil, to offer some polite, professional platitude and excuse herself. But she didn't. She just listened until I was finished, until my voice trailed off into an embarrassed silence. Then she finally spoke, her voice low and soft. "It's okay to feel that way," she said. "It's okay to be tired of being strong." The words were so simple, so direct, but they landed on me like a physical touch, like a warm hand on my back. She saw me. In that moment, she saw all the frayed edges and the silent desperation I had kept hidden from the world, from my wife, even from myself. She didn't judge me. She validated me. And then she shared a piece of herself. She told me about her own father, how she had cared for him through a long battle with cancer a few years back. She spoke of the exhaustion, the guilt, the moments of black humor, the way it had changed her and set her on this path. She wasn't trying to equate our experiences, she was simply building a bridge. She was showing me I wasn't alone. She talked about her dream of Italy, and the way she described it, it was more than a vacation. It was a tangible thing, a symbol of life and vibrancy, of ancient stones warmed by the sun, of loud, passionate conversations over wine, of everything our house was not. She was sharing her escape hatch with me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to climb through it with her. Those late-night conversations became my drug. I lived for them. My day became a long, tedious countdown to the moment Sarah would go to bed, and there was a chance, just a chance, that Maya would be on her break, and I could have 10, 15 minutes of her undivided attention. It was a pathetic, desperate existence, but it was the only thing that made me feel alive. We talked about books, about films, about the families we grew up in, about our quiet, unfulfilled dreams. The physical pull I felt towards her, that initial spark of attraction, was now being forged into something far stronger and more resilient. It was being reinforced with the steel of emotional intimacy. I was falling for the sound of her voice in the quiet kitchen, for the way her eyes held mine, for the simple, incredible fact that when I spoke, she listened. I was becoming addicted to being seen. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that this silent, emotional affair was walking a path from which there would be no return. We were building a world for two in the shadows of my dying marriage, a world that felt more real and vital than anything else in my life. The emotional intimacy we built in the late-night quiet of the kitchen was a fragile, dangerous thing, a world constructed of words and shared glances. I told myself it was enough. I told myself it was a harmless pressure valve, a way to survive the crushing weight of my life. But I was a fool to think a fire like that could be contained by conversation alone. It was always looking for oxygen, for fuel, for a way to burn in the open air. And one humid Tuesday afternoon it found it. The day was oppressive, the air thick and still, the sky the color of a dull bruise. I was at the dining room table, pretending to work, the lines of a blueprint swimming before my eyes. My thoughts, as they always did, had drifted to Maya. I was replaying our conversation from the night before, savoring the memory of her small, understanding smile. She was upstairs with Eleanor, and the house was locked in its usual tense quiet. And then the sound came. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, ugly, a sudden gagging, choking noise from Eleanor's room, followed by the frantic beeping of the bedside pulse oximeter. Every nerve in my body went rigid. The pencil fell from my hand and rolled across the wood floor. For a second, I was frozen, my blood turning to ice. Then adrenaline, raw and primal, flooded my system. I kicked back my chair, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor, a violent tear in the silence, and I ran. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. I burst into Eleanor's room to a scene of controlled chaos. Maya was already there, her body angled over my mother-in-law, her face a mask of intense concentration. Eleanor's face was a terrifying shade of blue, her body convulsing slightly. Maya didn't even look at me. "She's choking. Help me turn her on her side. Gently, Liam, gently." Her voice was calm, a steady anchor in the storm of my panic. I moved without thinking, my body responding to her commands. The next few minutes were a blur of focused activity. We were a team, moving together in a grim, unspoken choreography. Our arms brushed against each other, my shoulder bumped hers as we maneuvered Eleanor's frail body. It was a purely clinical proximity, born of necessity, but I was acutely aware of her physical presence in a way I had never been before. I was aware of the strength in her arms, the scent of her skin, clean and faintly floral, even amidst the acrid smell of fear. She had me clear Eleanor's airway while she administered a back blow, a sharp, precise motion that finally, mercifully, dislodged the obstruction. The sound of Eleanor taking a ragged, wheezing breath was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The alarm on the oximeter quieted. The crisis, as quickly as it had begun, was over. We stood there in the aftermath, panting slightly, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede, leaving a shaky weakness in its wake. Eleanor was exhausted, her eyes fluttering closed, her breathing still labored but steady. Maya adjusted her pillows, her movements fluid and efficient once more. When she was done, she stepped back from the bed and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for just a second. She looked utterly drained. We were alone, enclosed in the quiet room with the sleeping woman who tied us together, and in that moment, my gratitude and admiration for her calmness, for her competence, swelled into an emotion so powerful it overwhelmed me. I had to acknowledge it. I had to give it a voice. I took a step towards her. "Maya," I said, my own voice hoarse. She opened her eyes. Thank you," I stammered, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. I don't know what I would have done, I just froze. And as I spoke, I did the one thing I had been fantasizing about and dreading for weeks. I reached out and put my hand on her arm. It was meant to be a simple gesture of comfort, of thanks. But the moment my palm made contact with the soft, warm skin of her forearm, the air in the room crackled. It was like a live wire. A jolt, pure and sharp, shot up my arm, and I felt it register in every cell of my body. I could feel the delicate bones beneath her skin, the faint, thrumming pulse of her blood. It was the first time I had touched her with intention, a touch that wasn't an accident or a necessity. It was a confession. I saw her breath catch in her throat. Her dark eyes widened, and in their depths, I saw a reflection of my own shock, my own fear, and beneath it all, an unmistakable flicker of that same electric current. She didn't pull away. For 1, 2, 3 seconds that stretched into an eternity, she stood perfectly still, allowing the touch, accepting it. In that shared, frozen moment, everything we had kept unspoken was finally laid bare. Then the spell shattered. She flinched, pulling her arm back as if burned. I dropped my hand as if I, too, had been scorched. We stood there, a few feet apart, the space between us now, a humming, vibrant void. We couldn't look at each other. I stared at the pattern on the wallpaper, my mind screaming. She stared at the floor, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The silence that descended was 1,000 times heavier than any before it. The professional boundary had been vaporized. The emotional affair had just found its physical starting point. I mumbled something, an apology or another thank you, I don't even know what, and fled the room. For the rest of that day, we moved around each other like magnets turned to repel. A shared glance was impossible. A simple word was a monumental effort. But the memory of that touch lingered on my palm, a phantom heat, a brand. The line had not just been crossed, it had been erased. And we were both left standing in the terrifying, thrilling new territory we had created, knowing there was no going back. The days that followed the touch in Eleanor's room were an exercise in exquisite torture. The silent, comfortable world we had built in the late hours of the night was gone, shattered by 3 seconds of physical contact. Now, the silence was a weapon. It was an accusation, a constant, humming reminder of the line we had almost crossed. We avoided each other with a painful, deliberate choreography. If I entered the kitchen, she would suddenly find a task to do in the living room. If she was in the hallway, I would retreat to my study. Our late-night coffee confessions were a thing of the past, and I felt their absence like a chronic ache, a hollowness in my chest that no amount of work or feigned normalcy could fill. The house had reverted to its former state of quiet misery, but now, for me, it was 100 times worse, because I had tasted an alternative. I had felt the warmth of another sun, and now the cold felt colder. The darkness felt darker. The tension was a high-tension wire pulled taut between us, vibrating with an energy that was becoming impossible to ignore. It was going to snap. It was just a matter of when. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. It had been a particularly brutal day. Eleanor was agitated and in pain, which meant Sarah was frantic and frayed, and Maya had been on her feet for 12 straight hours, her face pale with exhaustion by the time night fell. A merciless, driving rain had started in the late afternoon, lashing against the windows, isolating our home from the rest of the world. By 10 o'clock, Sarah had collapsed into bed, emotionally and physically spent. I was downstairs, listening to the storm, the rhythmic drumming of the rain, a match for the frantic beating of my own heart. I knew Maya's shift was ending. I knew she usually took the bus, and I knew I couldn't let her go. I couldn't bear the thought of this day ending, of her walking out into the storm, leaving me alone with this unbearable, unspoken thing between us. I was using the storm as an excuse, a flimsy shield for my own desperate intentions. I found her in the entryway, pulling on her raincoat. "The buses will be a nightmare in this," I said, my voice startlingly calm. "Let me give you a ride home." She turned, her hand frozen on the zipper of her coat. For a moment, I thought she would refuse. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the quick calculation of risk. It would be just the two of us, trapped in the small, intimate space of my car. It was a terrible, dangerous idea, and we both knew it. But then I saw her shoulders slump in a gesture of pure exhaustion, a silent surrender. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Thank you." The drive began in an excruciating silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the windshield wipers and the hiss of the tires on the wet pavement. Streetlights smeared across the windows, brief, fleeting bursts of orange and white in the darkness. I could feel her presence beside me like a physical heat. I was intensely aware of the space between us, a gap of mere inches that felt like a mile-wide canyon. I had to say something. The silence was eating me alive. "I'm sorry," I began, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, "for how I've been. Distant." She didn't look at me, just continued to stare out at the rain-streaked streets. "We've both been distant," she said softly. It was an acknowledgement. It was permission to continue. I took a breath. "What happened?" I said, finally naming the ghost that had been haunting us. "In Eleanor's room. My hand on your arm. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." I could feel her tense beside me. The air grew thicker. I kept driving for a few more blocks, my mind racing, before I pulled the car over to the curb on a quiet, tree-lined street, a block away from where I knew she lived. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the car roof. I turned to face her. In the dim, ambient light, I could see the conflict in her eyes, the vulnerability. "I can't do this anymore, Maya," I whispered, the words raw and honest. "I can't live in that house, in that silence, pretending. Before you came, I was just numb. I was a machine going through the motions. And then you started talking to me, you started seeing me, and it was like you woke me up, and I am so grateful for that, but it's also agony. Because now I'm awake, and I'm trapped. These last few days, not talking to you, it's been worse than anything before. It's worse than the numbness." My confession hung in the air between us, a desperate, selfish, and utterly true declaration. Her expression softened, the fear giving way to a profound sadness. "Liam," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "We can't." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I know all the reasons why we can't, but it doesn't change the fact that you are the only thing in my life right now that feels real." She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I felt it too," she whispered, a confession so quiet I almost missed it. "In the room, I felt it. That was all I needed. It was the only answer that mattered. In that moment, all the reasons not to, all the logic, all the guilt, it all evaporated like mist. There was only the rain, the darkness, and the woman sitting beside me who felt the same impossible thing that I did. I leaned across the center console, my movements clumsy and urgent. I put my hand on the side of her face, my thumb stroking her wet cheek, and then I closed the final inches between us. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision. It was the desperate, frantic meeting of two starving people. Her lips were soft and hesitant for a fraction of a second before they parted, responding to my hunger with a fervor that matched my own. It was a messy, ravenous kiss, full of the rain on her coat and the salt of her tears. I tasted her grief and my own, her loneliness and mine. My other hand went to the back of her neck, my fingers tangling in her damp hair, pulling her closer. Her hands came up to clutch at my shoulders, holding on as if she were drowning. It was a release, a dam of weeks, of unspoken desire and emotional turmoil breaking wide open, flooding this small, dark space with a raw, undeniable truth. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. The question of what now hung in the air, but the answer was already all over us, on our lips, in our ragged breathing. This was not an ending, it was an ignition. We didn't speak on the short drive. The decision had been made in the space between a kiss and a ragged breath, and words would only profane it. I drove past her apartment block and kept going until I saw the faded, buzzing sign of a roadside motel, a place of transient secrets and deliberate anonymity. The vacancy light glowed a sickly green against the rain-soaked darkness. I paid the night clerk in cash. A crumpled handful of bills passed under a plexiglass shield, avoiding his tired, indifferent gaze. He slid a keycard across the counter. The whole transaction felt sordid and unreal, a scene from a movie I never intended to star in. The room itself was exactly what you'd expect. It smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. The bedspread was a stiff, synthetic material with a questionable geometric pattern. The art on the wall, a faded print of a generic seascape. It was a cold, impersonal box, utterly devoid of romance or charm. And yet, the moment I locked the door behind us, the deadbolt clicking into place with a definitive finality, the room became the most sacred place on earth. The harsh glare of the overhead light made us both blink. The desperate, rain-swept magic of the car had vanished, replaced by a stark, terrifying reality. We stood there for a long moment, water dripping from our coats onto the thin carpet, the silence broken only by the low hum of the air conditioning unit. This was the point of no return. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was making my own heart pound against my ribs. But beneath the fear, I saw something else, something I had seen in the car. A raw, aching need that mirrored my own. I closed the distance between us, and my hands, trembling slightly, went to the zipper of her damp raincoat. She stood perfectly still as I slid it off her shoulders and let it fall to the floor. Underneath, she was wearing her simple caregiver's uniform, the pale blue scrubs that I associated with sickness and duty. It felt like I was unwrapping a secret. My fingers went to the buttons of her top, fumbling with them, my movements clumsy with anticipation. I unfastened the first, then the second, and then I saw it, a glimpse of black lace. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the plain, practical cotton I would have expected. It was a deliberate choice. A sign that she too had been thinking about this, fantasizing about it, wanting it. The realization sent a fresh jolt of desire through me, so potent it almost made my knees weak. I worked faster, pushing the scrub top off her shoulders, revealing a delicate, intricate black lace bra that did little to conceal the perfect, full shape of her breasts. She wasn't just my mother-in-law's caregiver anymore. She was a woman, a beautiful, desirable woman who wanted me. I reached out, my fingers tracing the edge of the lace where it met her warm skin. She shivered, a soft sound escaping her lips. I unhooked her bra and tossed it aside. Her breasts, full and pale, were finally free. They were more beautiful than I had ever imagined, tipped with dark, hardened peaks that seemed to beg for my touch. I leaned in and took one into my mouth, my tongue teasing the nipple, and she gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, her back arching as her hands came up to tangle in my hair, pulling me closer. I moved to her other breast, giving it the same attention, while my hands slid down her body, unfastening her pants, pushing them down over the gentle curve of her hips. Beneath, she wore matching black lace panties. I knelt before her, my hands gripping her waist, my lips trailing kisses down her stomach, lower and lower, until I reached the edge of the lace. The scent of her, clean and musky and purely female, filled my senses, driving me insane. I helped her out of her remaining clothes, and then tore at my own buttons and zippers, a frustrating impediment. When we were finally both naked, skin to skin, the last barrier was gone. I pushed her back onto the bed, onto that cheap, stiff bedspread, and came down over her. The kisses were no longer exploratory. They were consuming, deep and wet, my tongue dueling with hers. My hands were everywhere, learning the shape of her, the curve of her waist, the swell of her hips, the firm, round globes of her backside, which I squeezed in my hands. Her own hands were just as frantic, roaming over my back, my chest, my shoulders, her nails scraping lightly against my skin. She was moaning now, soft, continuous sounds of pleasure, her hips beginning to move against me in a silent, urgent plea. I slid my hand between her legs and found her already slick and ready, a testament to a desire that matched my own. The wetness, the heat of her, was an invitation I couldn't refuse. I positioned myself between her thighs, and she opened for me without hesitation. I looked down at her flushed face, her eyes squeezed shut, her lips parted and swollen from my kisses. Then I pushed forward. The feeling of entering her was an indescribable mix of friction and slick heat, a feeling of coming home to a place I'd never been. She cried out, a sharp, high-pitched sound that was part pain, part pure ecstasy as I filled her completely. For a moment, I held still, just savoring the feeling of being inside her, of our bodies finally joined. Then I began to move, slowly at first, then with a building rhythm. The only sounds in the room were the wet, slick sound of our bodies moving together, the creak of the cheap motel bed, and our ragged, synchronized breathing. Her moans grew louder, deeper, all pretense of holding back gone. She was crying my name, her voice thick with pleasure. I changed our position, pulling her up to straddle me, her heavy breasts swinging just above my face. I watched her ride me, her head thrown back, her hair a dark cascade against the pale pillow, and the sight was the most erotic thing I had ever witnessed. Then I flipped her over, taking her from behind, my hands gripping her hips, driving into her with a raw, primal force. The sound of my flesh slapping against hers was a brutal, beautiful rhythm. The climax, when it came, was a violent, shattering explosion. I felt her body tense and convulse around me as my own release tore through me. I cried out, a raw, guttural sound, collapsing on top of her, utterly and completely spent. We lay there for a long time, tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, listening to the sound of our own hearts slowly returning to normal. The reality of what we had just done beginning to dawn in the quiet, sterile room. The silence that followed our climax was heavier and more profound than any silence I had ever known. It was a vacuum, sucking all the heat and sound and frantic energy out of the room, leaving behind only the cold, stark truth of what we had done. We lay tangled together in the cheap motel sheets, our bodies cooling, our breathing slowly returning to a normal rhythm. I didn't speak, and neither did she. There was nothing to say. Every possible word, "I'm sorry, thank you, what now?" was both a monumental understatement and a terrible cliché. We had spoken with our bodies, a desperate, frantic conversation that had left us both shattered and spent. After a long while, she shifted, pulling the thin sheet up to cover herself, a gesture of sudden modesty that felt almost painful after our raw intimacy. I slid out of the bed, my movements feeling clumsy and alien in the quiet room. The floor was cold beneath my feet. Getting dressed was a slow, deliberate act of returning to a life I no longer felt I belonged to. Each piece of clothing, my shirt, my pants, my shoes felt like a costume, the uniform of a man I was only pretending to be. Liam, the husband, the architect, the dutiful son-in-law. It was all a lie. We didn't kiss goodbye. We didn't even make eye contact as we stood by the door. There was just a shared, fleeting look of deep, bottomless panic, a silent acknowledgement that we had ignited a fire that would likely consume us both. I drove her home in that same pre-dawn grayness, the world outside the car slowly coming to life. The first few joggers were out. A man was walking his dog. A newspaper truck was making its rounds. The sheer, unapologetic normality of it all was an insult. How could the world just continue on as if nothing had happened, when my own personal world had been fundamentally, irrevocably altered? I felt like a ghost moving through a city of the living, my secret a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. When I dropped her at her corner, she got out of the car and walked away without looking back, disappearing into the entrance of her building, and I was alone. Driving into my own neighborhood felt like returning to the scene of a crime. The manicured lawns, the stately houses, the sleeping cars in the driveways, it all seemed like a facade. My own home, with its warm porch light that Sarah always left on for me, looked like a trap. I slipped inside as quietly as I could, my key turning in the lock with a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. The house was quiet. It smelled of home, of coffee and cinnamon from the day before, of the faint, clean scent of laundry detergent. And standing there in the entryway, I became aware of another scent, clinging to my clothes, my skin, my hair. It was Maya, a faint, musky, floral perfume, mixed with the undeniable scent of sex. I felt contaminated. I felt like a carrier of a disease, bringing a plague into the sanctity of my own home. I stripped off my clothes right there in the hallway, leaving them in a guilty pile on the floor as if they were radioactive. I needed to wash her off me. The shower was a desperate, frenzied ritual. I turned the water on as hot as I could possibly stand it, the needles of spray punishing my skin. I scrubbed myself raw with soap, trying to erase the memory of her touch, the phantom sensation of her hands on my back, her legs wrapped around my waist. But the steam-filled enclosure became a confessional, a private cinema where the events of the night replayed in vivid, excruciating detail. I saw her face beneath me, her eyes closed in ecstasy. I heard her cries, the sound of my name on her lips. I felt the convulsive peak of our shared climax. The more I scrubbed, the more vivid the memories became, burned into the backs of my eyelids. The water couldn't wash away the guilt, because the guilt wasn't on my skin. It was inside me, a poison that had already seeped into my soul. Clean but feeling filthier than ever, I crept into our bedroom. Sarah was asleep, lying on her side, her face turned towards me. In the soft light filtering through the blinds, she looked peaceful, almost childlike. Her breathing was slow and even. Her face, free from the lines of stress and worry that marked her waking hours, was the face of the woman I had fallen in love with a decade ago. She was vulnerable, beautiful, and utterly oblivious. She was in her own private hell, grieving for her mother, and she was trusting me, her partner, her rock, to be there with her. And where had I been? I had been in a sordid motel room, burying myself in the body of another woman. A wave of self-loathing so powerful it made me physically sick washed over me. I had to brace myself against the doorframe, my breath catching in my throat. I was a cheat, a liar, a monster. I was betraying this sleeping, innocent woman in the most fundamental way possible. I slipped into my side of the bed, careful not to make a sound, careful not to let any part of my body touch hers. I lay there on my back, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the cold, empty space between us. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I hated myself. I despised the man I saw in the reflection of my own mind, and yet, underneath the crushing weight of the guilt, a treacherous ember still glowed. It was the memory of the pleasure, the memory of the raw, unbridled passion, the feeling of being truly alive, of being desired, of escaping the slow, quiet death of my own life for a few stolen hours. It was a terrible, terrifying paradox. My soul recoiled from the sin, but my body still hummed with the memory of it. I was disgusted by my betrayal, but a dark, selfish, primal part of me was already craving another hit of that forbidden drug. I lay there in the darkness beside my sleeping wife, a traitor in my own bed, and I knew with a chilling, soul-crushing certainty that I was already lost. The obsession had taken root, and it was going to destroy everything. I existed in a state of purgatory for 3 days. 3 cycles of sunlight and darkness where I moved through my home like a phantom, the ghost of the man I used to be. The guilt from that night in the motel was a constant sour taste in the back of my throat. I would look at Sarah, listen to her tired, strained voice on the phone with a hospice nurse, and I would feel a wave of self-disgust so profound it was physically nauseating. But the guilt was no longer a singular emotion. It now had a competitor, a rival that was stronger, more seductive, and far more relentless. It was the craving. It was a physical ache in my bones, a desperate, clawing need for Maya. The memory of her body, of her taste, of her cries, had become a permanent resident in my mind, replaying on a loop. I couldn't work. I couldn't think. The silence in the house, once a source of misery, was now a source of terror, because in the quiet, the craving grew louder. On the 4th night, I broke. I couldn't bear it another second. My hands were shaking as I typed out a simple, pathetic message on my phone, hiding in the downstairs bathroom like a guilty teenager. "I have to see you." The reply came almost instantly, a single sentence that made my heart leap into my throat. "My apartment. After my shift. I'll leave the door unlocked." The drive to her apartment was different from the drive to the motel. The desperation was still there, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, electric anticipation. This wasn't an anonymous act of desperation anymore. I was going to her home, her sanctuary. I was crossing a threshold into her world, and the significance of that was not lost on me. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building with a charming, slightly neglected courtyard. The door, as promised, was unlocked. When I stepped inside and closed it behind me, I felt as if I had entered another dimension. His house was a museum of quiet grief, silent, sterile, and drained of color. Her apartment was small, but it was vibrantly, unapologetically alive. Books overflowed from shelves. Plants crowded the windowsill, reaching for the light. The air smelled of coffee and old paper and something else, something that was just her. It was a space that was deeply personal, and being there felt like a privilege, a new, more profound level of transgression. She was standing in the middle of the living room, wearing a simple gray t-shirt and soft-looking sweatpants, her hair down, falling over her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, more real than she ever did in her uniform. We stared at each other for a moment, the space between us humming with unspoken questions. Then she closed the distance and kissed me. This kiss was nothing like the frantic, desperate collision in the car. It was slow, deep, and knowing. It was a kiss that said, "I remember what we did and I want to do it again." It was the most intoxicating welcome I had ever received. There was no fumbling this time, no awkwardness. We moved with a newfound confidence, a shared understanding of the pleasure that awaited us. I peeled her t-shirt over her head, and she worked on the buttons of my shirt. Our hands explored familiar territory with a new, deliberate slowness. This wasn't about a frantic release. It was about rediscovery. I led her to the bedroom, a small, cozy room with a large, comfortable-looking bed, and I laid her down gently. I wanted to worship her. I wanted to erase the sordid memory of the cheap motel and replace it with something devoted, something that felt like a true act of passion. I knelt beside the bed and began to explore her body with my mouth, starting with her stomach, my tongue tracing lazy circles on her warm skin. She sighed, her hands tangling in my hair. I moved lower, my lips and tongue finding the soft, sensitive skin of her inner thighs. And then I gave her the one thing I had been dreaming of, the one act of intimacy that felt like the ultimate surrender. I tasted her. The experience was overwhelming, a heady mix of her unique, musky scent and the clean, salty taste of her desire. I took my time, learning her, listening to the way her soft moans grew in intensity, her breath catching in her throat. I heard the wet, slick sounds of my own devotion, and the sound drove me wild. Her hips began to buck against my mouth, her quiet moans turning into sharp, uncontrolled cries of pleasure as her orgasm seized her, a beautiful, violent storm that I had created. When her shudders subsided, she pulled me up onto the bed, her eyes dark and hazy with pleasure. Now, it was her turn. She returned the favor with a slow, languid skill that left me breathless, proving that her own desire was just as deep and complex as mine. The frantic need of our first encounter was replaced by a luxurious, unhurried exploration of mutual pleasure. When I finally entered her, it felt different. It was still the same incredible heat, the same perfect fit, but the desperation was gone, replaced by a deep, powerful intimacy. We moved together with an easy, practiced rhythm, our eyes locked, our hands clasped together. We were no longer just two bodies colliding in the dark. We were partners in a secret, sensual dance. I pulled her on top of me, wanting to watch her, and then I turned her onto her stomach, entering her from behind. I leaned down, my lips close to her ear, whispering to her how beautiful she was, how much I wanted her. My words timed to the rhythm of my thrusts into her body. I felt her tense beneath me, heard her cry out as she found her release for a second time, and her climax triggered my own. A deep, shuddering release that felt as if it were pulling the very soul from my body. We didn't flee from each other this time. We lay in her bed for what felt like hours, our limbs tangled, the sweat cooling on our skin. We talked in low murmurs, not about my wife or her job or the impossible situation we were in, but about nothing at all, the comfortable, easy chatter of established lovers. Being there, in her bed, in her home, felt more right than anything had felt in years. The guilt was still there, a shadow lurking in the corner of the room, but for now it was held at bay by the overwhelming power of the addiction. When I finally left her apartment and walked back out into the night, I felt a soaring, euphoric sense of being alive. But as I drove home, the euphoria began to fade, and the familiar, gnawing craving took its place. It was no longer just a need. It was a hole inside me that only she could fill. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would be back. Again and again. I was no longer just a man having an affair. I was an addict, and she was my drug. An affair, I discovered, is a living thing. In the beginning, it is fragile, born of whispered confessions and frantic, desperate couplings in anonymous rooms. It survives on fear and novelty. But if you feed it, if you nurture it with lies and stolen moments, it grows stronger, bolder. It develops a routine. Our affair had entered this new phase, a dangerous, comfortable adolescence. The raw panic of our first encounters had subsided, replaced by a confident, almost arrogant rhythm. We had our system, a coded language of text messages, a schedule built around Sarah's grief support meetings and Eleanor's doctor appointments. The risk was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but we had learned to live with it, to manage it. The fear, which had once been a deterrent, had slowly, insidiously, become part of the thrill. We were no longer just surviving our secret, we were mastering it. And like all masters of a dangerous craft, we were becoming reckless. The ultimate transgression, the one I had sworn to myself I would never commit, was bringing the affair into my own home. My house was a sanctuary of my betrayal, the place I returned to after seeing her, scrubbing her scent from my skin, washing the lies from my mouth. To bring her into my bed or any bed under my roof felt like a sacrilege too far, but the temptation, like a persistent fever, began to build. It was a Wednesday. Sarah was taking Eleanor for a series of scans at the hospital, a grueling, all-afternoon affair that would leave them both exhausted. Maya had the day off from her official duties, but she was meeting me. The original plan was her apartment, the now familiar and comforting space that had become our haven. But that morning, as I stood in the oppressive quiet of my empty house, a new perverse thought took root. Why should we have to hide in her world, or in seedy motels? This was my world, and I wanted her in it. The thought of taking her in my own house, of possessing her in the very space dedicated to my marriage, was an act of rebellion, so profound, so audacious, it left me breathless. I texted her the change of plans. She hesitated, her reply a simple, "Are you sure?" I knew she understood the risk, but I also knew she was as addicted to the thrill as I was. A few minutes later, another text. Okay. When she arrived, letting herself in with the key I had given her, the act itself felt like a violation. Seeing her stand in my living room, among the photos of me and Sarah, the furniture we had picked out together, was both deeply wrong and intensely arousing. We didn't go to the master bedroom. Even I had my limits. We went to the guest room, a room that was rarely used, a sterile space that we could claim as our own for a few hours. The lovemaking that followed was different yet again. It was hushed, urgent, charged with the electric current of our transgression. Every sound from outside a passing car, a dog barking, made us freeze. Every kiss was stolen. Every moan suppressed into a pillow. The danger heightened every sensation. The feel of her skin against the backdrop of my quiet suburban life was the ultimate high. We were lying in the aftermath, tangled in the sheets, our bodies still humming with pleasure when we heard it. A sound so mundane, so familiar, it took a second to register its catastrophic implications. The low, grinding rumble of the garage door opening, ice, pure and absolute, flooded my veins. My heart stopped. Sarah. She was home. Hours early. Panic, stark and blinding, erupted. "Get dressed," I hissed, leaping out of bed. The next 30 seconds were a frantic, silent ballet of pure terror. We scrambled for our clothes, our movements clumsy, our fingers fumbling with buttons and zippers. My mind was a white-hot scream. What had I done? The guest room was a disaster, the bed a mess, 2 glasses on the nightstand. I smoothed the covers with shaking hands, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any trace of her, a stray hair, an earring. I grabbed her purse. "The downstairs bathroom," I whispered, my voice a ragged croak. "Lock the door. Do not make a sound." She nodded, her face ashen, her eyes wide with the same terror I felt, and slipped out of the room. I took a deep breath, trying to slow the frantic hammering in my chest, and went downstairs to intercept my wife. I met her in the kitchen, as she was putting her keys on the counter. "You're home early," I said, my voice a marvel of forced calm. "They had a cancellation," she said, sighing. She looked exhausted. "Mom's exhausted. I just couldn't sit in that waiting room for another 3 hours. I thought I'd come home and lie down." Her eyes scanned my face. "Are you okay? You look flushed." My heart seized. "Just came in from the yard," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "It's hot out." She seemed to accept it, turning to get a glass of water. It was in that moment that my phone, lying face up on the kitchen island, buzzed. I glanced at the screen and my blood ran cold. It was a notification from Maya. The preview of the message was visible for anyone to see. That was incredible. I'm still shaking. Sarah was right there, her back to me at the sink. If she turned around, if she glanced at the counter, my life would be over. Everything, my marriage, my home, my reputation, would be incinerated in a single moment. I didn't think. I lunged, my hand covering the phone, snatching it from the counter in a single, fluid motion. "Work," I said quickly, my voice tight as I turned away from her and shoved the phone into my pocket. Always bothering me. She turned around, a faint, tired smile on her face. "Tell them to leave you alone for 5 minutes," she said, before heading upstairs towards our bedroom. I stood frozen in the kitchen for a full minute, my body trembling with the receding adrenaline. Maya was still locked in the bathroom a few feet away. My wife was lying down in our bed. The walls of my life were closing in. The terror was absolute. But as the panic began to subside, a new, monstrous feeling began to surface. A dizzying, perverse exhilaration. We had gotten away with it. We had danced on the very edge of the abyss and survived. And the chilling, horrifying truth that settled in my soul was that I had never felt more alive. I was no longer just addicted to her. I was addicted to the fear itself, the terror of that close call. The ice in my veins as I snatched my phone from the counter should have been a wake-up call. It should have been the final, terrifying warning that sent us scurrying back to our separate lives, shaken but grateful to have escaped the inferno. A rational man would have ended it right there, would have severed the connection, and spent the rest of his days counting his blessings. But I was no longer a rational man. Addiction doesn't bow to logic, and the potent cocktail of fear and relief we had shared that day didn't push us apart. It fused us together. We were no longer just lovers. We were co-conspirators, partners in a high-stakes crime, bound by the shared trauma of our near discovery. That night, after Sarah was asleep, I got a text from her. "I've never been so scared in my life." My reply was simple. "Me neither, but I'm glad you were there." We had stared into the abyss together, and in doing so, we had forged a bond that was stronger than steel. Something fundamental shifted in me after that day. The frantic, almost desperate need for the physical act began to subside, replaced by something deeper, quieter, and far more dangerous. I found myself craving the quiet moments as much, if not more, than the passionate ones. I craved the safety of her small apartment, the comfort of her presence, the sound of her voice. The sex had been the key that unlocked the door, but it was the world on the other side of that door, a world where I was seen, heard, and understood that I had truly become addicted to. The affair was no longer an escape from my life. It had become the most real part of my life. The rest, my job, my house, my strained interactions with my wife felt like the performance. The time with Maya was the only time I felt I could take off the mask. Our conversations, which had already been intimate, now delved into new territory. In the quiet darkness of her bedroom, after a session of slow, tender lovemaking, we would lie awake and talk for hours. I found myself telling her things I had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even to Sarah in the happiest days of our marriage. I told her about my father, a cold, demanding man whose approval I had spent my whole life chasing, and the deep-seated fear of failure he had instilled in me. I confessed that I felt my career as an architect was a fraud, that I had traded my early creative ambitions for the safe, lucrative world of designing sterile office buildings. I was confessing the failures and insecurities that made up the core of my identity. And she didn't just listen, she understood. She would ask questions, gentle, probing questions that showed she was truly hearing me. She would place her hand on my chest and tell me I was more than my job, more than my father's son. She was healing parts of me I didn't even know were broken. In return, she opened up to me in ways that made me feel both humbled and fiercely protective. She told me about growing up poor, about the constant feeling of being on the outside looking in. She spoke of her dream of Italy not just as a vacation, but as a place where she felt her soul belonged, a place of history and art and passion that was a universe away from the transient, often heartbreaking world of caregiving she inhabited. We began to play a dangerous, painful game, the what-if game. What if we had met 10 years ago? I would whisper into her hair, at a coffee shop, before any of this. She would smile sadly. "We'd be living in a small, messy apartment in Rome," she'd reply. "You'd be painting, and I'd be running a tiny bookstore. We would build these beautiful, impossible worlds together, furnished with details and shared laughter, and then we would fall silent, the tragic reality of our situation descending upon us. We were two architects designing a dream house on land we could never own. Our lovemaking transformed. The frantic, hungry energy of our earlier encounters softened into something imbued with the depth of our emotional connection. It became less about the friction and the release, and more about the communication. I would spend what felt like hours just looking at her, memorizing the curve of her collarbone, the sprinkle of freckles on her shoulders. Our kisses were long and slow. Our touches were deliberate, tender, meant to convey all the things we couldn't say. When we were joined together, we would hold each other's gaze, a silent conversation passing between us. It was an act of profound, heartbreaking intimacy. This was no longer just sex. We were making love. And in the quiet moments afterward, as we lay tangled in her sheets, my arm around her, her head on my chest, I felt a sense of peace, of rightness, that I hadn't felt in a decade. And it was in one of those peaceful, post-coital moments that the true nature of my betrayal finally became clear to me. It wasn't the sex. It wasn't the lies or the motel rooms or the close calls in my own home. The true betrayal, the deepest and most unforgivable sin, was this. I had given my soul to another woman. I had taken the most vulnerable, hidden parts of myself, the parts that should have belonged to my wife, and I had handed them to Maya for safekeeping. I had let her see me, know me, and nurture me back to life. I had cheated on Sarah not just with my body, but with my very essence. The affair had ceased to be a simple act of infidelity. It had become a transfer of allegiance. My heart, my mind, my soul, they no longer resided at my address. They lived here, in this small apartment, with her. The realization didn't bring a thrill, only a deep, profound, and soul-crushing sadness. I was hopelessly in love, and the joy of that love was now inextricably bound to the agony of its impossibility. The world we built together, Maya and I, existed outside of time. It was a pocket universe fueled by stolen hours, whispered secrets, and the potent illusion that our feelings were the only thing that mattered. We lived in the tender afterglow of our lovemaking, in the charged silence of a shared glance across a room, in the fantasy of a future in Rome. The real world, with its sickness and its sorrow, had become a backdrop, a muted gray landscape against which our vibrant, colorful love story unfolded. I had become so immersed in our narrative that I had forgotten it was fiction. I was in my office, sketching a design, but really just counting the minutes until I could text her, when reality came roaring back, not as a whisper, but as a wrecking ball. The phone call was from Sarah. I heard the sound of her voice, and knew instantly that something was wrong. There was none of the usual tired frustration. It had been replaced by a thin, sharp, splintered terror. "Liam," she choked out, her voice breaking. "You need to come home. Now, it's Mom. The nurse is here. I think it's time." The drive home was a blur. The comfortable, melancholic sadness I had been swimming in, the self-indulgent drama of my secret love, it all evaporated, exposed as the cheap, childish fantasy it was. In its place was the cold, hard, undeniable reality of death. When I walked into the house, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The quiet tension of the past few months was gone, replaced by a heavy, sacred stillness, the kind of silence that precedes a momentous event. A hospice nurse I didn't recognize stood in the living room, speaking in low, hushed tones. Sarah rushed to me the moment I stepped through the door and collapsed into my arms, her body racked with shuddering, silent sobs. I held her, my arms wrapping around her trembling frame. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it was not a performance. There was no resentment, no distance. There was only my wife, a grieving daughter clinging to me for support, and my own profound, aching duty to hold her up. And then I saw Maya. She was standing at the edge of the room, speaking quietly with the nurse, pointing to a chart. She looked up as I came in, and our eyes met for a fraction of a second across the room. There was no flicker of intimacy, no secret acknowledgement of our shared world. Her face was a mask of calm professionalism. She was no longer the woman who whispered my name in the dark, the woman whose body I knew as well as my own. In her crisp, clean uniform, she was Maya, the caregiver. She was a stranger. She gave me a single, compassionate nod, the kind of nod one gives to the grieving husband, and then turned her attention back to the nurse. The professional barrier between us, the one we had so spectacularly demolished, had been re-erected, and it was now 1,000 feet high, made of steel and reinforced with the stark reality of the situation. The woman I was in love with was right there, 10 feet away from me, and she had never felt farther away. The hours that followed were a long, slow-motion vigil. I became the dutiful husband, the steady son-in-law. I made coffee. I answered the phone, speaking in low tones to other family members. I sat on the sofa with my arm around Sarah, her head resting on my shoulder, her tears soaking my shirt. I was playing the part my life had assigned me, but my heart was filled with a dizzying sense of vertigo. I felt like an imposter, a fraud sitting at the center of this sacred family ritual. My secret life with Maya, which had felt so profound and all-consuming just that morning, now seemed disgustingly frivolous. A selfish, trivial little drama played out in the wings, while the real, significant tragedy was happening center stage. How could I have been so lost in our fantasy of a bookstore in Rome while this raw and brutal reality of life and death was waiting for me right here? The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up my neck. At one point, I found myself alone with Maya in the kitchen for a brief moment. She was preparing a syringe with a dose of morphine, her movements economical and precise. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything we couldn't say. The air was no longer charged with desire, but with a shared, unspoken grief. This was her job, her calling. She was an angel of mercy, here to shepherd a soul out of this world, and I was just the husband of her patient's daughter. A footnote in this final chapter. She must have sensed my turmoil, because she paused, her eyes meeting mine. Her gaze was clear, compassionate, and completely devoid of the intimacy we had shared. "Be with her, Liam," she said, her voice soft but firm, nodding her head in the direction of the living room where Sarah was. "She needs you right now. That's all that matters." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a dismissal of what we had. It was an absolution. A quiet, definitive release. In that moment, she wasn't my lover. She was my conscience, gently but firmly pushing me back towards my duty. Later, I stood in the doorway of Eleanor's room. The lights were dim. Sarah was sitting on one side of the bed, holding her mother's limp hand, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of love and sorrow. On the other side of the bed stood Maya, silently checking Eleanor's pulse, her expression focused and serene. My wife and my lover. The two poles of my fractured existence united in this small, sacred space, and as I looked from one to the other, the intoxicating, complicated fog I had been living in for months finally cleared. I saw not a distant wife, but a woman I had made a vow to, a woman who was facing the darkest moment of her life and deserved my every ounce of strength. And I saw not my passionate lover, but a competent professional, a kind woman whose job here was almost done. The affair, our beautiful, painful, secret world, could not survive in this room. It withered and died in the harsh, clarifying light of death. I knew, with a certainty that felt like a death itself, that it was over. Desire was a luxury, duty was a law, and the bill for my transgression had finally come due. Eleanor passed away in the quiet hours just before dawn, not with a struggle, but with a gentle sigh, as if she were merely letting go of something she was tired of holding. Her death, when it came, was an anticlimax, a profoundly peaceful end to a long and painful war. The days that followed were a blur of prescribed rituals. Phone calls were made, relatives descended, and a funeral was planned. The house, which had been a quiet sick room, was suddenly filled with the low murmur of sympathetic voices and the smell of baked goods brought by neighbors. Through it all, I moved like an automaton, performing the duties of the grieving son-in-law, the supportive husband. And through it all, Maya was a quiet, efficient presence in the background, her official role now over, but staying a few extra days to help Sarah sort through her mother's things, a final act of kindness. Our final goodbye happened where our story began, at the front door. The house was full of family, but we found ourselves alone in the entryway for a fleeting moment. I was handing her a final envelope with her paycheck and a small bonus I had insisted on. It felt like a crude, insulting transaction, reducing everything that had passed between us to a matter of dollars and cents. She took it, her fingers brushing against mine for a fraction of a second. A final, phantom spark. "Thank you, Liam," she said, her voice soft and professional. "For everything." I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she added. "Sarah is a strong woman, she'll be okay." We stood there, suspended in a moment of unbearable, unspoken history. In her eyes, I saw it all. The motel room, her apartment, the rain on the windshield of my car, the terror and the passion. I wondered what she saw in mine. Regret? Love? Cowardice? She gave me a small, sad smile, a final, heartbreaking acknowledgement of our beautiful, impossible secret. Then she turned, opened the door, and walked out of my life. I watched her go down the walkway, get into her car, and drive away until she was just a tiny speck disappearing at the end of the street. I was watching my life split in two, watching the part of me that knew how to feel happiness drive away forever. After the funeral, after the last of the relatives had gone home, a new kind of silence settled over the house. It wasn't the oppressive silence of illness anymore, but the vast, hollow silence of absence. The guest room upstairs was cleaned out, its door now permanently closed, but its emptiness was a palpable presence. The house was haunted, not just by the ghost of Eleanor, but by the far more vibrant ghost of Maya. Every corner held a memory. The kitchen was the site of our first confessions. The hallway was where we had shared that first electric touch. The guest room door was a monument to our recklessness. I was living in a mausoleum dedicated to a love that no one else knew had ever existed. Sarah and I tried to find our way back to each other. In the months that followed, the sharp edges of her grief began to soften. She started to smile again, to suggest we go out to dinner, to reach for my hand as we watched a movie. She was turning back towards me, seeking the comfort and partnership of her husband, ready to rebuild our life together, and I failed her every single day. I was a dutiful ghost. I held her hand, but my touch was distant. I went to dinner, but my mind was elsewhere. I made love to my wife, but I did it with my eyes closed, pretending she was someone else. The secret I carried was a wall of ice between us. She couldn't see it, but she could feel the cold radiating from it. She knew she wasn't getting all of me, and the confusion and hurt were beginning to show in her eyes. One evening, about 6 months after her mother's death, we were sitting in the living room, reading in a comfortable silence. She put her book down and looked at me, her expression one of deep, searching concern. "Liam," she said, her voice quiet. "Are you okay?" The question was so simple, so direct. It completely disarmed me. "You seem so far away," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Ever since Mom died, it feels like you're a million miles away. It feels like I lost you too, somewhere in all of this." It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea for me to come back to her. And I had no answer. The truth would shatter her. Another lie would be the ultimate cruelty. So I just sat there, the silence stretching between us, my inability to answer the most damning confession of all. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I stood in the upstairs hallway, staring at the closed door of the guest room. It was just a door, just an empty room. But to me, it was everything. It was the tomb of the man I might have been. My affair with Maya hadn't been a simple act of infidelity. It had been a glimpse into another life, a life where I was known, and loved, and alive. She didn't destroy my marriage. She simply held up a mirror and showed me that it had been dead for years. She gave me the greatest gift and the cruelest curse, the knowledge of what true connection felt like. And now I am left to live with that knowledge, trapped in a life of quiet duty, forever haunted by the ghost of a passion that was more real than anything I have ever known. I did not choose my wife in the end. I did not choose my lover. I chose my sentence. And it is a life sentence, to be served in the quiet, hollow rooms of this house, forever.